The New Mutants is all set to release by the end of this month and finally break its rescheduling streak as of now. After a prolonged production run, which saw the famous takeover of Fox by Disney, The New Mutants is ready to unravel a new chapter of the X-Men franchise and brings in a unique visual appeal that the previous X-Men movies have not yet explored, but the most blaring question about it remains largely unaddressed. Should the New Mutants be part of the MCU? Every piece of information surrounding the New Mutants is taken with a pinch of salt now, and for good reason. Variety reported back in 2019 that Disney did not see significant box office potential in the New Mutants. Since then, it's faced a rocky production experience to say the very least, and this does not account for what happened in the months leading up to that point. The film's troubles are hopefully over once and for all now, but it still inspires speculation about lining its comic book roots with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The New Mutants would obviously be an exciting addition to the MCU's growing catalog of superheroes.
Is that everyone?
What, you wanted more?
The theories surrounding their inclusion in the MCU are far from unfounded, and it's an idea that MCU executives would no doubt have toyed with at some point in the past. The official Disney fan club called D23 also played into this possibility when it described the New Mutants as an electrifying new addition to the Marvel Cinematic Universe in an article that was later removed from the website. While there may or may not have been more signs of these rogue teenagers tiptoeing into the MCU, there sure are a lot of ways to bridge their entry into it. However, there's also a lot of evidence out there to support why this shouldn't happen. So today, we're going to look at all the problems associated with the New Mutants coming into the MCU. To begin with, let's try to first understand the New Mutants as a film. Director Josh Boone was a fan of the New Mutants comics growing up. He created a comic book adaptation of Bill Sienkiewicz and Chris Claremont's original work into a trilogy with his best friend, Nate Lee, who then also wrote the New Mutants screenplay with him. The two eventually brought their book to producer Simon Kinberg and pitched the idea of what would go on to become the New Mutants movie, minus the trilogy concept. Boone's personal connection to the New Mutants comics and extensive engagement with their stories made him the perfect filmmaker to lead the project. So much so that we were paying close attention to the fate of the unfinished film when Disney's acquisition of 20th Century Fox put it at risk of getting dropped or being shelved. The movie, however, was far too deep into production by the time Disney took over, so it became one of Fox's few major movie titles to be retained in the post-merger era. This is big news because it means that Marvel Studios has very little creative control over the film, and this quality reflects in its distinctive look. The movie has been called a departure from the Singerverse, and also looks nothing like the typical MCU feature. It's also the first film in the X-Men franchise with notes of horror. Besides the Marvel comics, Stephen King is one of Josh Boone's inspirations, and the writer's influence shines through in the director's work. All of these elements come together to set the New Mutants in its own tonal alley, which does not exactly align with the current MCU identity. If the New Mutants were to be introduced into the MCU, they certainly wouldn't be the first shared characters between the Disney and Fox parallel universes. While previously Fox-owned Marvel enterprises like Fantastic Four and X-Men are now an official part of the MCU family, there have been no clear indications that the MCU will leverage the mutant origins of Scarlet Witch to bring the X-Men under its umbrella. For now, MCU's Scarlet Witch arc will focus on the powers she gained from the Mind Stone. Therefore, any connections to her mutant lineage have been set aside to make way for her sorcery to take center stage. Now, given these circumstances, even the most promising chances of the New Mutants making their MCU debut seem very remote. The last, but hardly the least important thing to consider before moving on to the next point is the MCU's commitment to its family-friendly image.
Language.
Although recent Marvel movies have started addressing fairly complex issues, the fact remains that the studio will not jump at the idea of venturing into the horror genre, at least just yet. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness was starting to go down that route, but backtracked just as quickly when Kevin Feige dismissed any association and called it an MCU film with, quote, scary sequences instead. Given that many fans were rooting for the Doctor Strange movie to be a horror film, I'd say that the MCU will stay away from causing an outrage by defying this convention just to bring the New Mutants into its universe now. The New Mutants don't fit in very well with the rest of the MCU superheroes. The next prominent argument which contradicts the entry of the New Mutants into the MCU does not seem all too important in theory, but at the same time proves their MCU stint to be a far-fetched possibility anyway. During Comic-Con at home, the main cast of the New Mutants, along with Josh Boone, were interviewed by ScreenRant, and they weren't keen to jump on the MCU ship anytime soon. See, the thing is, the New Mutants was produced and treated as a world of its own. It has a tonal and aesthetic treatment which doesn't compare to any MCU movie or even the various renditions of X-Men that have been made so far. The New Mutants is a bunch of teenagers who are hidden away from the world as they attempt to control their volatile superpowers. As actor Charlie Heaton pointed out, the characters in this film are too embroiled in their own struggles to take up responsibilities as saviors and superheroes. The full range of their superpowers is still to be explored, and even if they don't necessarily pale in comparison to the rest of the Marvel heroes, it would be tricky to see these two distinct worlds merge. Josh Boone basically agreed with this sentiment, but said that he'd be open to exploring the idea of the New Mutants in the MCU if the right opportunity came along. The New Mutants are not poised to make their MCU entry, but that doesn't mean that the possibility is entirely out of access. The redacted article on D23 that I mentioned earlier, or Feige's use of caution, could be a well-orchestrated way of keeping the characters just within reach without setting any precedents for their inclusion in Marvel's cinematic universe. If that's the case, then it means that the problems with bringing them on board are still relevant as ever, and ironing them out is taking time. If you check out the movie's synopsis on the official 20th Century website, the blaring fact that the film acknowledges Illyana Rasputin, aka Magic, as the sister of Colossus will not escape your eye. Despite this, Josh Boone confirmed that we won't be seeing any X-Men cameos in the movie, and the reason behind this also stems from the overall chaos of the X-Men timeline.
McAvoy or Stewart? These timelines are so confusing.
Let's get right into that as we move towards the final leg of this discussion. Most importantly, the New Mutants' arrival in the Marvel Cinematic Universe will cause a colossal confusion in the already clunky X-Men timeline and also lead to major continuity errors. All of the problems with the New Mutants coming into the MCU that we've seen so far could be fixed using some or the other solutions, even if it doesn't look too good for the storyline. The characters, for instance, could be spruced up to fall in line with the MCU superheroes, and the tonal differences of the film could be accommodated as a means of diversification. The one argument that is difficult to refute, though, has been staring us in the face all along. I am referring, of course, to the several timeline clashes and continuity errors that we'd have to deal with if we fed into the allure of introducing New Mutants into the MCU. Now, the most obvious continuity question facing the MCU, if the mutants were eased into its universe, would be in regards to their role in Avengers Endgame. There's a theory gaining traction that the mutants were actually created as a result of the multiple snaps on Earth that occurred between the events of Infinity War and Endgame. They created an enormous influx of energy whose effects no one could really fathom. Rocket characterized it as the Earth becoming ground zero for a quote-unquote power surge of enormous proportions. It was observed that this energy was mostly gamma radiation, which becomes a huge but unexplored cue for the entry of the mutants. Marvel Studios could work over the optics and explain why the mutants were absent from the MCU and were treated with distrust for most of their lives at the same time. A severe lack of knowledge about their origins and effective ways to control their powers would have made the humans in the post-snap era weary of the mutants. And that's harsh, but fair, seeing as all hope in superhuman powers was lost before Endgame regained it just as suddenly. Even though theories like this one come in handy to write off discrepancies based on shared universe continuity, the timelines still don't match up. X-Men and Fantastic Four were the earliest cinematic adaptations of the comics because they were the most popular characters. Marvel Comics was at a financial low when they sold the rights to these characters, leaving less popular comic book heroes like Iron Man for the studios to produce. I know that sounds understandably odd today, but it's worth remembering that Iron Man was a surprise hit, so no one at that point had the foresight to really worry about juggling multiple worlds and overarching timelines. Now we have X-Men divided between two parallel universes and a clunky chronology brought in by Days of the Future Past, which put the mutants on a different trajectory. Since then, fresh installments like Logan and Dark Phoenix have already taken place in a new setting in which older characters like Professor X and Magneto have already drawn scrutiny for not having aged as visibly as they should have. There are, of course, several more plot details to take care of. frankly, it makes sense to hold off on filling the gaps in Marvel's cinematic family since Phase 4 will rally up a bunch of exciting new characters. The Eternals have already been roped into the universe and could draw upon major unexplored links with the Celestials. Judging by the Phase 4 plans and tidings, the MCU looks like it's preparing to expand into multiple parallel universes.
I'm sorry, you're saying there's a multiverse?
And it's better for the MCU to exist as a multiverse in the longer run, rather than being a melting pot of superhero narratives, since we've already experienced the disorder of its vibrant storylines. As important as it is to bring in more identities into its fold, Marvel should also do justice to its characters by giving them the cinematic room that they need to grow. For now, that means keeping the New Mutants out of the MCU and waiting to see what happens. Well, that's our time with you for today's video. We hope that you enjoyed our insights into the latest Marvel happenings. Oh hey, and don't forget to subscribe to ScreenRant and hit that little bell icon. That way you'll receive timely updates on our newest uploads. Take care.